Like the Ecclesiasticus, the second book in the wisdom genre of the Apocrypha that we will begin looking at this evening is not that long, 19 compared to 51 chapters. Neither is it that interesting or that reliable. So don't feel bad if you haven't had enough time to read the Wisdom of Solomon, or if you have had time to read it, you got stuck halfway through. It's just so boring. It doesn't make a lot of sense, like the book of Ecclesiasticus did. Now, did you recognize, as we were studying in our month-long study of Ecclesiasticus, that although the name is similar to a book in our Bible, in no way is Ecclesiasticus similar to that book? But what book is it similar to in our Bible? Proverbs. It's made up of a lot of maxims, just like the book of Proverbs is. So Ecclesiasticus, it happens to be named similar to Ecclesiastes, but really it's connected with the book of Proverbs. I say that to say this: the Wisdom of Solomon is more like Ecclesiastes than it is Proverbs, or than Ecclesiasticus is like Ecclesiastes. But it doesn't, let me hasten to add, it doesn't bear the same mark, one of close proximity to Ecclesiastes in the same degree that Ecclesiasticus does to Proverbs. This is really strange, weird book. We might entitle it The Wisdom of Pseudo-Solomon, because we certainly know King Solomon did not write this book. It's our second example of the wisdom section in the Apocrypha. Both of these obviously deal with wisdom. Both of them personify wisdom. But I would say Ecclesiasticus is the best, and the Wisdom of Solomon is the more technical of the two. Really, wisdom is just a full-scale theological, philosophical treatise on wisdom, whereas Sirach is a book of maxims, like the book of Proverbs. So we'll refer to the book by its shortened title, Wisdom. Remember, both of them can be referred to as wisdom: the wisdom of Jesus, the wisdom of Solomon. But the former of those generally is entitled the book of Ecclesiasticus, and this the Wisdom of Solomon, or simply Wisdom. We're going to try to do the whole book tonight because, it's long. It's 19 chapters, but if you flip through it or read through it, you see the 19 chapters are long, so it takes up a large amount of the Apocrypha. It's fairly lengthy, but, well, I'll save that to get into when we get into the next point, the authorship of the book. It's weird and it's strange in many regards. And we have no doubt at all about the type of individual who wrote the book. We don't know his name. The only one we do know is Jesus ben Sira. We don't know the name of the author of the Wisdom of Solomon, but he definitely is a Hellenistic Jew, filled with the concepts of Greek philosophy.
Amen.
And he probably lives in Alexandria, since that was the chief philosophical Hellenistic capital in that part of the world. Wasn't over in Palestine somewhere, but it was down in Alexandria, and perhaps around 100 BC. He was quite schooled in Greek philosophy, especially Platonism and Stoicism, and schooled in rhetoric as well. Now, he's a Jew. Remember, these books are written by Jews in the Apocrypha. You're not going to have just some Gentile, especially a pagan Greek Gentile, writing a book that gets into, well, not canon of Scripture, but into the collection of Jewish writings. That wouldn't make any sense. It's written by a Jewish author, there's no doubt about that, but he's almost more of a Hellene than he is a Jew. Now, I said that chiefly, as far as Greek philosophy is concerned, he's schooled in Platonism and Stoicism. Now, he's got the Stoic concept of the universal logos, and he's got the Platonic view of several different things that we'll get to whenever we come to the errors of the book. But let's just begin with chapter 8 and verse 7, where we see the four virtues of Plato mentioned here. Chapter 8 and verse 7. Whenever we discussed self-realization in Christian ethics, we discussed Plato, Aristotle, and so forth, and we gave you the 4 cardinal virtues of Plato. If you excel in these, then you're the righteous man of wisdom, temperance, justice, and courage. And notice we have right here in the verse, I mean, this proves that he was schooled. He didn't just happen to pick this up. He was schooled in Platonic thought. If virtue, Wisdom 8:7, if virtue is the object of a man's affections, virtue, the fruits of wisdom's labors are the virtues. You see, you have to read very carefully because he's very intelligent. Beyond really the simple average man, you've got to read every sentence. It doesn't read in rhyme, in other words, like Ecclesiasticus does, where you generally can pick up the meaning because the meaning is obvious. The meaning sometimes is not so obvious here. If virtue is the object of man's affections, the fruits of wisdom's labors then are the virtues, and these are they: temperance, prudence, just another word for wisdom, justice, and fortitude, just another name for courage. So temperance, wisdom, justice, and courage, the 4 cardinal virtues of Plato. And then some of the church theologians added Paul's 3, faith, hope, and love, so we'd get a perfect number, 7. Pick that up right out of Greek philosophy, to pick up 3 virtues from Paul and add them to the 4 of Plato, so we got to have the number 7. That was very sacred to the church writers. So you've got 4 here: temperance, wisdom, justice, and courage. These are her teaching, and in the life of men there is nothing of more value than these. Which is not a Jewish belief at all. The Jewish belief is you have to have the law of Moses. There's nothing more important in life for a true Jew than the law of Moses. But not for a Hellenistically minded Jew, one who's been trained in Greek philosophy and Greek thought. He's following right in the steps of one of their founding fathers and leaders, Plato: temperance, prudence, justice, and fortitude. And then I said Stoicism. The belief in Stoicism is rather complex. I don't think we need to get into that, but just to sum it up, he has the same conception of the universal logos as did the Stoics of old. And so I guess you see that kind of would maybe tie in with studies in the Gospel of John chapter 1. In the beginning was the logos, the Greek says, not the word but the logos. And he was with God and he was God. So there's no doubt about authorship. We don't know his name. We could call him probably Alexander. That would be a good name to pick because he's very trained in Greek thought. We wouldn't want to pick Judah or David or something like that. That's too Jewish. But he's trained in Greek philosophy and he's trained in rhetoric, and the entire scheme and method of his book is one that is imbued with Hellenistic philosophy, all 19 chapters of it, which you'll see more as we go along. Okay, the purpose of the book. Now the first few verses, as well as, let me see, some verses over in chapter 6, 6:1 and 6:21, inform us that he's writing to the leaders of all the Gentile nations of the world. And it's been suggested by others, and it seems to me a plausible suggestion, that this is doubtful, that his real audience happened to be the Jews of Alexandria and probably the leaders among the Jews in Alexandria. You see how it's important now. Now you understand how we get this contingency of Jews way down there in Alexandria, where they were supposed to love their motherland, their homeland above everything, get near where the temple is. You see, we still have a temple during this time, 100 BC. It's been rebuilt. But you understand how they've transferred down there whenever Alexander conquers the world and kind of opens doors up. It's an open door policy all over the world for them to go. And they're without prophets, they're without true teaching, contrary to what some people, I was listening to a tape the other day, just to show you, again, what you have to know is what you know that makes you go. Where someone was teaching on intertestamental period and said, now there's no doubt about it that Israel had her prophets during the intertestamental period, we just don't have their prophecies written down. So, well, that certainly is not found in the Bible or outside of the Bible. The Bible contradicts it, and the extra biblical material contradicts that. So somebody hasn't been reading either in the Bible or out of the Bible, which I guess means no reading at all, to make a statement like that. That Israel had her prophets in the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. No way. No way. She didn't have any prophets. And to say that they had prophecies, they gave prophecies to Israel, but we just don't have any of those written down. Same person went on to say that the apostolic fathers were inspired in their writings. And you can hardly find anything wrong if you read their writings. Well, a lot of you have read that before. You've got some good comments in there, but you get into the Shepherd and you get into the Didache, just filled with mystical allusions to things that aren't in the Bible. Well, I don't know where they got all that. Certainly didn't get it from anybody that I've read from. Maybe that was a liberal they got it from. Sounds like liberal views to me. Amen. So anyway, I would lean toward the view that concerning the purpose of the book, that he's lying here in 1:1 and 6:1 and what did I tell you, 6:21 or somewhere along there. He's lying. And I think you'll see this as we go along. He's probably not writing to the leaders of the nations. He's probably writing this treatise on wisdom to the Jewish leaders. I mean, who's going to read this but other Jews? He can't send this, in copy form to people all over the empire, to various leaders of various Gentile nations. His real audience would be Jews in Alexandria, and particularly would be the leaders. And probably the purpose behind that is to encourage and instruct those, because they live in Alexandria, and therefore they're susceptible to the temptations of falling away from the Jewish way of life, which is what he's done. You see, that's what makes the book so weird and self-contradictory. You see, in verse 1 he says, "Love justice, you rulers of the earth. Set your mind upon the Lord as is your duty, and seek him in simplicity of heart." And in chapter 6 he goes on to come back to them. "Hear then, you kings." Well, see, Israel didn't have a king. Zedekiah was the last king in Judah. 586 BC, and Israel hasn't had a king in almost over 2,500 years. Israel has not had a king. So, according to what he's telling us, he couldn't be writing to Jews or to Israel because Israel has no king. The book of Hosea, chapter 3, predicts there will come a time when Israel has no king, and she's going to be restored and have a king in the future. I'll look the verse up quickly to make sure I quoted it right. Hosea 3 and verse 4, "The children of Israel shall abide many days without a king," which is prophecy of what's going to happen. Of course, Hosea is coming on the scene quite a bit before the time of the last king, but he said that for many days Israel will abide without a king, without a prince, without sacrifice, without an ephod, without teraphim. It says, "But in the latter days," the next verse, "but in the latter days they seek the Lord their God and David their king, and he'll come and rule over them." And he goes on in verse 3, "It's the Lord who gave you your authority." I'm over in chapter 6 now. "Your power comes from the Most High." Well, that's true, and that sounds like Romans 13. And then in verse 21, "You rulers of the nations, you must honor wisdom so that you may reign forever." But no one's going to be reading his book but other Jews. No matter how important he was, he couldn't get an audition before all the Gentile kings of the world and bring copies of the Wisdom of Solomon for them to read. So the purpose is probably to instruct, as I've said before, instruct the Jews in Alexandria, chiefly the leaders, because if you can teach them, then you work through them and their teaching to reach all the Jews. More than 100,000 of them, remember, live in Alexandria at this time. Population like Jerusalem. There's so many Jews here. To keep them from the easy temptation of falling away from the Jewish way of life unto the Hellenistic way of life. And he's really not one to teach on that, because what do we believe? What you say or what you do? And he has not done what he says for us to do. So he attempts to teach the true ways of Judaism while exposing the errors of sin and idolatry. There will be a chief section later on we'll look at on the subject of idolatry. And we'll say more about that purpose as we read some of the verses. And I think I can show you he's really not talking to rulers of the earth, the kings of the nations, but, well, let me sum it up in another way before we get to reading it. This is really what he's doing. He's criticizing, according to what he says, the rulers of the world. He goes on, let me say this, he goes on to report a conversation, evidently from them, that starts in 1:16 and it goes through 2:20. And then he goes on to prove how they're totally blind, this is totally a false view, and God's going to require this at their hand. Well, if he could paint that picture of the foreign Gentile leaders because of their false conceptions of things, then if the book gets into the hands of some of the leaders of the Jews in Alexandria, then he's kind of saved from, the bad predicament of coming and facing them outright and saying, now you guys are doing wrong, you're teaching wrong doctrine, you have wrong beliefs, you're falling after the way of the Gentiles. Because that'd be embarrassing and maybe it'd be a little too touchy of a situation to do that. So he writes and by example shows what will happen to people, and he names rulers of the Gentiles, what will happen to people who fall away from Judaism or who don't believe in Judaism, who have never embraced that, what will happen to them in the end. Therefore, hopefully, these Jewish leaders will read that and it will prick their mind, prick their conscience, without him having to come out and name them and specify them. So if you understand that, if we understand it like that, then it makes a lot of sense to me that he's probably lying to us in chapter 1 and verse 1 and in chapter 6 and verse 1. In a roundabout way, he's trying to get back to the Jewish leaders. So that sums up authorship and the purpose of the book. Now an outline, and through the outline we'll take our time to look at the book. Now probably more than any other book in the Apocrypha, the author is always digressing. And people who've studied the book in detail, more detail than I have, really recognize this, and you can recognize it even when you briefly skim over. I'll point out something of how you can do that just by briefly skimming it here in a moment. But he's always digressing. He mentions something, and it seems to bring something else to his mind, and so he digresses for a chapter or two. Sometimes just for a sentence or a paragraph or two, but on several occasions for whole chapters. Takes off chasing that rabbit. And he finishes that, and so he comes back to his original topic. And then he'll go in that for a little while longer, and then he digresses again. Why I'm saying that is to say this, it makes the book very difficult to divide. Because where do you put the divisions after the digression and say, now go back to point A, and that's what this digression is not about, and the material that comes after this really goes back before the material that came before to get us back to whatever he was originally talking about. So I'm going to stay with kind of a broad outline. It's very, very difficult to divide too minutely in the book. So if I stay broad, then I stay safe. Chapters 1 through 5, we'll just have 3 divisions. Chapters 1 through 5, I've entitled Dual Immortality. How many of you have read the whole book? Okay, not a whole lot of people. I didn't think that a lot of people would have read this book. It's difficult to read because you can't tell what he's talking about. You got to remember, now he's pausing. He's not on the subject you were on in the sentence before. He's on another train of thought now. If you keep going long enough, you'll clue back into where he left you earlier. Sometimes you don't clue back in because you can't find where he clues back in, if he ever does. So, dual immortality. He teaches that all men will live forever. But your state depends on whether you are evil or righteous on the earth. Dual immortality. So, he doesn't teach the annihilation of the wicked. He says the wicked will live forever. But their state, it's like the Christian doctrine of heaven and hell. Your state in the next life depends on your existence in this life. If you're evil, then that determines your state. For the Christian, it's eternal punishment, hell. If you're righteous, well, the state for the Christian is heaven, eternal happiness and bliss. He doesn't go into heaven and hell, I don't mean that, but he does teach there are 2 states. All men will live forever. And your state that you receive depends on how you live in this life. One question that has to be brought up immediately when we're talking about immortality is resurrection. One thing that the book is lacking on, because Greek philosophy is lacking in, any doctrine of physical or bodily resurrection. He never tells us how these people will live forever. Remember in Ecclesiasticus, one portion of Scripture of Ecclesiasticus that we looked at, suggested, according to some people's interpretation, and I said I don't really feel that's what he meant, but that your immortality is seen in your progeny and the children that you leave behind, and then your grandchildren and your great-grandchildren. That proves that you live forever. Well, he's got some views. He's got various views, many views. Some of them are similar to that, but he never really explains what he means by living forever. Is it, are we living in body, living in spirit, living in soul? Where is it? He's really not going into that, because that's not his purpose. His purpose is for instruction in this life. To get into the good realm of the next life, you have to be good in this life. Chiefly, he's speaking to the Jews. And so he begins right in the first chapter, chapter 1, verses 13 to 14. For God did not make death. All of the first 12 verses are introduction to wisdom. Remember, that's the title of the book, The Wisdom of Solomon, or Wisdom. And here's one of his digressions, and he digresses on immortality, and he'll do that all the way through chapter 5. So really you've got chapter 1, verse 1 through 12, and then it skips, and I'll show you this when we get over there. It skips all the way over to chapter 6:1. So from 1:13 all the way through the end of chapter 5 is the digression, the first major section, the digression on dual immortality. For God did not make death. Well, and another thing, let me say, he's got a lot of wisdom, a lot of insight, a lot of head knowledge anyway to what the Old Testament said, just like Jesus ben Sira did. He's got a lot of knowledge of what the Old Testament said. We'll see this toward the end of the book particularly. But what he says here is true. God did not make death and takes no pleasure in the destruction of any living thing. So said Ezekiel. God doesn't take pleasure in the death of the wicked even. He created all things that they might have been. And as he goes on to explain, that they may continue to forever have been. And then if you look down, starting in verse 16, he, as a third party, is witnessing conversation of others and recording it for us. And these are godless men who give this conversation. And what's the identity of these men? Probably not what he said in the first verse, rulers of the earth, but probably rulers of the Jews in Alexandria. And they're falling away from Judaism. So let's start reading here, and this conversation, this episode goes from 1:16 down through 2:20. You see, the book is just a myriad of confusion trying to divide it up. And I'm not even going to try to divide it up like we did Ecclesiasticus. We're just going to skip around because that's really what he does. But I can give you this section, 1:16 through 2:20. Is the false argument given by the Jewish leaders in Alexandria for living a life of revelry. Is what it amounts to. You'll even find the term, I think, in here. In other words, it doesn't pay to live a good life. And what's the topic of this section? Immortality. He's going to teach us it does pay to live well in this life. So let's start with verse 16. Godless men by their words and deeds have asked death for his company. They're asking for death because of the way they live. Thinking him their friend, they have made a pact with him because they are fit members of his party. And so they have wasted away. They said, you see, he never tells us who the they are. Evidently, he assumes that we're going to connect it back with 1:1, the rulers of the earth, the false pagan leaders who don't know anything, who aren't Jews, who haven't studied the Torah, who don't know the teachings of Moses and the prophets. But probably, and there's no way we can definitely prove this, but it seems plausible to me that he really has reference to Jewish leaders in Alexandria. They said, so keep that in mind so you'll understand better. They said to themselves in their deluded way, and this starts their little conversation that he's really a third party to looking in upon. Our life is short and full of trouble. When a man comes to his end, there's no remedy. No man was ever known to return from the grave. By mere chance were we born. Well, that wasn't a Jewish belief. And afterwards we shall be as though we had never been. For the breath in our nostrils is but a wisp of smoke. Our reason is a mere spark kept alive by the beating of our hearts. When that goes out, our body will turn to ashes, and the breath of our life disperse like empty air. You see, it's a very pessimistic outlook. That's why I said the book is like Ecclesiastes in some regards, pessimistic outlook. Now keep in mind, this isn't the position of the author of the book. It's the position of the Jewish leaders that he feels have fallen away from the Jewish faith. But the theology and philosophy of the book teaches that the author of the book himself has fallen away from Judaism to Hellenism. Our names will be forgotten with the passing of time, and no one will remember anything we did. Our life will blow over like the last vestige of a cloud. As a mist is chased away by the sun's rays and overborne by its heat, so will it too be dispersed. A passing shadow and so forth. Very pessimistic. Down to verse 9. On the basis of all of this, he said, let none of us miss his share of the good things that are ours. Who cares what traces our revelry leaves behind? This is the life for us. It is our birthright. In other words, they do not believe, whoever these people are, do not believe in immortality, in personal immortality. Now, if my contention and other people's contention is true, that the they said of 2:1 refers not to pagan leaders but Jewish leaders, then it gives us some insight to Jewish theology in the intertestamental period, at least down here in Alexandria, assuming that's true, that they've lost their belief in personal immortality. Yeah. It's the 1 Corinthians 15:32-33. Let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. That's the theology that they are getting across here. Let us eat, drink, and be merry. Let none of us miss the good share of the good life. Because who cares about the traces of our revelry that we'll leave behind? It won't follow us, in other words. And the author of the book teaches it will follow you into the next life. This is the life for us, and it is our birthright. Down with the poor and honest man. Can you believe they're that heretical? Whoever is saying this. And again, I just remind you, how could he be writing of and to the Gentiles? He's not concerned about them, and they're not concerned about him. But the Mosaic Law taught just the opposite. You be concerned for the poor. And the prophets wept whenever the honest men perished from the earth. Let us tread him underfoot. You know, you never like a goody two-shoes around you if you want to do bad. Let us show no mercy to the widow and no reverence to the gray hairs of old age. For us let might be right. Uh-oh. Well, he probably got that from Alexander. Weakness is proved to be good for nothing. Let us lay a trap for the just man. He stands in our way, a check to us at every turn. He girds at us as lawbreakers and calls us traitors to our upbringing. You see, traitors to your upbringing, the Gentiles were not brought up right. They didn't have the law that the Jews had. So who's this upbringing here? It has to be the upbringing in the Jewish way of life, and he has to be speaking of Jews. He knows God, so he says. He styles himself the servant of the Lord. You know, he is a living condemnation of all of our ideas. The very sight of him is an affliction to us, because his life is not like other people's and his ways are different. The author styles himself as this one that they're criticizing, you see. He rejects us like base coin and avoids us and our ways as if we were filth. He says that the just die happy and boasts that God is his Father. Let us test the truth of his words. Let us see what will happen to him in the end. Verse 20, let us condemn him to a shameful death. Because when you die, that's the end. And that is the end of the conversation. And so the author comes back in with his teaching in verse 21. So they argued from 116 through 220, and were very wrong. Blinded by their own malevolence, they did not understand God's hidden plan. They never expected that holiness of life would have its recompense. They thought that innocence had no reward. But God created man for immortality. You see, in 1:13 he said God didn't make death. In 2:23 God did make man to live. It made him the image of his own eternal self. It was the devil's spite that brought death into the world, and the experience of it is reserved for those who take his side, which is true biblical teaching about the devil and the origin of evil in the universe. It came through death, which came through the devil. So probably this is the conception of some of the Jewish leaders, perhaps all, who perhaps are under some form of persecution. That's generally when you give up all hope and blaspheme God. Maybe they're under some form of persecution, as the Jews have always been since they rebelled against their God and Maker. And this would necessitate to them, in their minds, this unscriptural view of so many things. Pessimistic outlook, because life holds nothing anymore. Then in chapter 3, again, he's going on to teach about the same topic. Over in chapter 4, it's all dual immortality. You can look at the paragraphs, and one will be about a good man, and another will be about a bad man. Chapter 4, verse 1, it's better to be childless, provided one is virtuous, for virtue held in remembrance, this is one verse I wanted to show you, for virtue held in remembrance is a kind of immortality. Well, we wonder, is that his conception of immortality? That you live in the memory of people once you die, as a very virtuous, wise individual, like Abraham Lincoln is still alive today, we could say, in our memory. His virtues, or his vices, whatever you want to think about, what he did and said and believed and stood for, it's alive today. But you see, for the Christian or for the Old Testament Jew, we're concerned about, but is he physically and indivisibly alive somewhere as one personality, not split up so that, well, we remember him in our minds and in his children and in the home that he built and all of this? Do we remember him, and that is his immortality? You know, he's perished and gone. Or is he an indivisible unit somewhere? You know, his spiritual essence, we're not talking about his body right now, his spiritual essence, personally, is he alive somewhere? Immortality means you're alive, you'll live forever. But is he personally alive, or in memory form? This is almost memory form here. Virtue held in remembrance is a kind of immortality because it wins recognition from God and from men too. He goes on talking about evil men. Then he comes to good men. Like in verse 10, there was one such a man, a good man, who pleased God, and God accepted him and took him away while he was still living among sinful men. So he knows Genesis. He was snatched away before his mind could be perverted by wickedness or his soul deceived by falsehood. Well, what he lived to be, about 365 or something like that, Enoch did, so that's plenty of time to be perverted. I doubt he was snatched away before he had time to be perverted. He just preserved himself in all the wickedness of the world. Because evil is like witchcraft, 1 Samuel 15, 22, 23. Same teaching in chapter 5. The just man shall take his stand full of assurance and confront those who oppressed him and made light of all his sufferings. The theme of suffering, maybe they're under persecution, and the wicked look at the righteous and mock him because of that. The sight of him, there will be terror and confusion. They will be beside themselves to see him so unexpectedly safe home. Then he goes on to talk about the wicked man in that section, then down to verse 15, back to the good man, back and forth, bad, evil, bad, evil. Then he comes over to the good and the righteous. The just live forever, immortality. So skipping over all of that, we come to chapter 6. Now, if you take chapter 6:1 and 1:1, here's that long digression. He's speaking about wisdom in chapter 1, verses 1 through 12, to the rulers of the earth, so he tells us. And look at 6:1, hear then, you kings. And he just said that in 1:1, you rulers of the earth, you kings. So he's been pausing to digress that whole time from 1:13 all the way through the end of chapter 5. So he comes back to the kings, hear then, you kings, take this to heart, and so forth. Which brings us to the second division on our outline of the book, chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9 are the essential section and heart of the book, where we have the teaching on wisdom. First of all, dual immortality, 1 to 5, then 6 to 9, the essential section on wisdom. In chapter 6, he introduces us to wisdom, picking up where he left off in chapter 1. So chapters 1 and 6 are really the introduction to wisdom, or as the page entitles it, In Praise of Wisdom. And yet he is getting across the idea the whole time that he's not talking to Jews but to Gentile leaders. So we will pick up where we left off, verse 3. We've read that before. Similar to Paul's teaching in Romans 13. He will put your actions to the test and scrutinize your intentions. You rulers of the earth? No, probably you leaders of the Jews. Though you are viceroys of his kingly power, which the leaders were of the Jews in Alexandria. You've not been upright judges. You do not stand up for the law or guide your steps by the will of God. Swiftly and terribly will he descend upon you, for judgment falls relentlessly upon those in high place. We know the whole book he's talking to and about leaders. He says, because he says there in verse 5 that judgment's going to fall swiftly upon those in high place, because to whom much is given, much is required. The small man may find pity and forgiveness, but the powerful will be called powerfully to account. For he who is all men's master is obsequious to none, and is not overawed by greatness. Small and great alike are of his making, and all are under his providence equally, but it is the powerful for whom he reserves the sternest inquisition. In other words, what he's teaching there is that God's not deferential because he's the master of all men. You see, if someone were over him, he'd have to defer to them. But because God is master over all men, he said he's obsequious to none. And he goes on in verse 12, wisdom shines bright and never fades. So he goes on into his teaching on wisdom. The man who rises early in search of her will not grow weary in his quest. Thus, verse 20, the desire of wisdom leads to kingly stature. If therefore you value your thrones and your scepters, you rulers of the nations, the third time he's referred to them like this, you must honor wisdom so that you may reign forever. But then he says, what is wisdom? Well, let me tell you about it. So chapters 7 and 8, he details his personal quest for wisdom. Chapters 7 to 8. He's telling them to be wise and have wisdom, but after all, what is it? He says, okay, I'll tell you from experience what I know about wisdom. I too am a mortal man like all the rest, descended from the first man who was made of dust, Genesis 2:7, and in my mother's womb I was wrought into flesh during a 10-month space. How do you like that? They knew about it's going to take about 9 or 10 months and the child is going to be born. Compacted in blood from the seed of her husband, The seed doesn't come from the female, but the male. And the pleasure that is joined with sleep. When I was born, I breathed the common air, was laid on the earth that all men tread. The first sound I uttered, he said, is the sound that everybody utters first, even kings, and that's, I cried. He says in verse 5, no king begins life in any other way. Therefore I prayed, and prudence was given to me. I called for help. There came to me a spirit of wisdom. I valued her above the scepter and the throne, and reckoned riches as nothing beside her. I counted no precious stone her equal, because all the gold in the world compared with her is but a little sand, and silver worth no more than clay. What I learnt with pure intention, I now share without grudging. Nor do I hoard for myself the wealth that comes from her. She is an inexhaustible treasure for mankind. Those who profit by it become God's friends, commended to him by the gifts they derive from her instruction. You see, it's teaching on wisdom, but it's not teaching on wisdom like the Bible does. It's always the wisdom of the spiritual man and its spiritual wisdom, not just all this abstraction, which is what the Hellenistic view of wisdom was. God grant that I speak according to your will, and that my own thoughts may be worthy of his gifts. For even wisdom is under God's direction, and he corrects the wise, and so forth. A knowledge of the structure of the world and the operation of the elements, the beginning and end of epics and their middle course. A knowledge of the structure of the world and the operation of the elements, the beginning and end of epics and their middle course. The alternating solstices and changing seasons, the cycles of the years and constellations. Well, all that's pretty neat, but the Bible says that wisdom means that you obey God, that you don't sin in your life. That's what Proverbs and Ecclesiastes teach, not that you know about the summer solstice or something. Anybody can know that. That's worldly wisdom. That's the worldly wise man and not the godly wise one. Chapter 8 and verse 2, wisdom I loved. I sought her out when I was young and longed to win her for my bride, and I fell in love with her beauty. She adds luster to her noble birth, because it is given her to live with God, and the Lord of all things has accepted her. She is initiated into the knowledge that belongs to God, and she decides for him what he shall do. If riches are a prize to be desired in life, what is richer than wisdom? The active cause of all things. You see what I'm saying? That we have yet to come across a good reference to obey the Lord, fear the Lord. That's the beginning of wisdom, is to fear the Lord. Not all of just abstraction about wisdom, wisdom, wisdom. Then it goes on into verse 7, which we gave you, is a Platonic view of what the good life is all about. You're a good man if you're a wise man. You're a wise man if you have the 4 cardinal virtues. Down in verse 14, you see he enters into personification. I shall rule over many peoples. The nations will become my subjects, and so forth. So wisdom is personified like it was in Proverbs 8, and I believe Ecclesiasticus 24. It's personified as well. So chapter 6 is in praise of wisdom, 7 to 8, his personal quest for wisdom. Then chapter 9 is his personal prayer. Personal prayer. That's a little bit similar to at least a couple, or at least one of those 3 prayers of Jesus ben Sira in Ecclesiasticus. Then the final section of the book is really the most fascinating. That's chapters 10 through 19. Chapters 10 through 19 give us the reflection of wisdom in history, as seen in God's dealings with Israel and with the nations, but particularly with the Egyptians. The reflection of wisdom in history, seen in God's dealings with Israel and the nations, particularly the Egyptians, and therefore particularly the Exodus episode. A whole lot is given concerning the Exodus in chapters 10 through 19. let me read a few verses to you here in chapter 10. Chapter 10 basically just shows his knowledge of the book of Genesis. He's going in chronological order to begin with. And chapter 10 basically devotes itself to Genesis. And then by chapter 11, we're getting over into the Exodus period. Let's see where to start. I think we can start with verse 1 because every verse, see if you can guess what he's talking about. You could quiz yourself just by reading chapter 10 to tell me who he's talking about or what he's talking about or what chapter in the book of Genesis. Wisdom, it was who kept guard over the first father of the human race when he alone had yet been made. So you get Adam, you get first part of Genesis 2, you see. She saved him after his fall. That's not too good. God in his sovereign mercy saved Adam, not his wisdom. His wisdom got him into trouble. It was perverted wisdom. She saved him after his fall and gave him the strength to master all things. No, he lost his dominion in the fall. God gave him the dominion, not wisdom, back in Genesis 1. It was because a wicked man forsook her in his anger when he murdered his brother in a fit of rage and so destroyed himself. You just test yourself as we go along. Through his fault, the earth was covered with a deluge. And again, wisdom came to the rescue and taught the one good man to pilot his plain wooden hulk. No, he never piloted that. That's impossible to pilot the ark on that sea without a shore. But he's trying to work this Greek concept of wisdom in here. Everything is connected to wisdom. It was she when heathen nations leagued in wickedness were thrown into confusion, who picked out one good man and kept him blameless in the sight of God, giving him strength to resist his pity for his child. You see, we're talking about the battle of the nations in Genesis 14. Now I think we're down to Abraham and his son Isaac. She saved a good man from the destruction of the godless. Who would that be? Lot. He escaped the fire that came down on 5 cities. Sodom and Gomorrah, remember, were just 2 of 5 cities. There were 3 others named. Sodom and Gomorrah are just the 2 most infamous of the 5. Cities whose wickedness is still attested by a smoking waste. Now I'd like to know personally whether that's a true statement or not. We know that no ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah are found today. It's believed by some that the southern tip of the Dead Sea now covers the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah. But it'd be interesting to know whether it was really true in his day that you could see the ruins of the city, or the cities. And since that time, which it could have happened over 2,000 years, the Dead Sea has expanded. Although it's not expanding anymore, it's drying up, of course, now. By plants whose fruit can never ripen, and a pillar of salt standing there as a memorial of an unbelieving soul. Wow. Wisdom they ignored, and they suffered for it, losing the power to recognize what is good, and leaving by their lives a monument of folly, such that their enormities can never be forgotten. Still speaking about the cities. But wisdom brought her servants safely out of their troubles. It was she, when a good man was a fugitive from his brother's anger, who guided him on the straight path. Who could that have been right there? We're not quite far enough along to be down to Joseph's time. I think he'll come into that here shortly, though. She prospered his labors, made his toil productive. When men in their rapacity tried to exploit him, she stood by him and made him rich. Well, someone tried to get some silver for someone. She kept him safe from his enemies and preserved him from treacherous attack. Some woman attacked someone, remember. She gave him victory after a hard struggle and taught him that godliness is the greatest power of all. It was she who refused to desert a good man when he was sold as a slave. She preserved him from sin, went down into the dungeon with him, so forth. It was she who rescued a God-fearing people, a blameless race from the nation of oppressors. So he's leading up now to the Exodus, which brings us into chapters 11 and 12. Chapters 11 and 12 dealings with the Exodus. God's dealings in the affairs of the Exodus. Now, it's not in strict order, because you'll see sometimes, like in verse 1, he'll skip out ahead and then backtrack and come back to the Exodus and come back to the plagues. Wisdom, working through a holy prophet, brought them success in all they did. They made their way across an unpeopled desert and pitched camp in untrodden wastes. Well, that holy prophet would be Moses. The self-same means by which their oppressors had been punished were used to help them in their hour of need. Those others found their river no unfailing stream of water, but putrid and befouled with blood. Punishment for their order, that all the infants should be killed, while to these thou gavest abundant water unexpectedly, connecting the lack of water the Egyptians had with the abundance that the Israelites had in their wanderings in the wilderness. Now, I'm not going to take the time to read all of this long section. We're going to come back and comment on some isolated verses when we look at the errors of the book. Then chapters 13 through 15. We're still under this final section. Chapters 13 through 15 are the second chief digression in the book. The first one was on dual immortality. This one is a chief digression into idolatry. A digression into idolatry. Because the Jews would be susceptible to the idolatrous practices of the Greeks whenever they lived down in Alexandria. It even titled it The Evils of Idolatry. So let's start then with verse 4 of chapter 13. If it was through astonishment at their power and influence, men should have learnt from these how much more powerful is he who made them. Which is what Isaiah teaches. For the greatness and beauty of created things give us a corresponding idea of their Creator. Yet these men are not greatly to be blamed, for when they go astray, they may be seeking God and really wishing to find Him. Well, that doesn't hold too much water. Paul said that they knew God, and they, with full knowledge in Romans 1, forsook God and sought after the vanities of their own foolish and darkened imagination. How do you like verse 10? The really degraded ones. These are the really degraded ones, he said, are those whose hopes are set on dead things, who give the name of gods to the work of human hands, to gold and silver fashioned by art into images of living creatures, or to a useless stone carved by a craftsman long ago. Suppose some skilled woodcutter fells with his saw a convenient tree and deftly strips off all the bark, then works it up elegantly into some vessel suitable for everyday use. And the pieces left over from his work he uses to cook his food and to eat his fill. That's taken directly from the book of Isaiah. Yeah. Verse 15, then he makes a suitable shrine for it and fixes it on the wall, securing it with iron nails. Chapter 14, the man again who gets ready for a voyage and plans to set his course through the wild waves cries to a piece of wood more fragile than the ship which carries him. The ship ought to be your goddess, you see, not the carved figurehead or the picture on the flag on the mast that you're praying to. You ought to pray to the ship. It's stronger than the mast or the carved figurehead. Then, let's see, down in verse 15. This is interesting in verse 15. Some father, overwhelmed with untimely grief for the child suddenly taken from him, made an image of the child and honored thenceforth as a god what was once a dead human being, handing on to his household the observance of rites and ceremonies, worshiping your own dead child. Then this impious custom, established by the passage of time, was observed as a law. Or again, graven images came to be worshipped at the command of despotic princes, when men could not do honor to such a prince before his face because he lived far away. They made a likeness of that distant face and bowed down before that. He's teaching different ways that idolatry has crept up on the scene of history. Verse 23 even speaks of the horrors of the orgies and the child sacrificial services that they had, warning these Jews that he's writing to that one little sin, one little backsliding away from God's going to lead you probably the whole way into idolatry. And look what you have to look forward to. Then finally, chapters 16 through 19. Since 13 to 15 were a chief digression, then 16 has to go back to chapters 11 and 12. So he resumes 11 and 12 from the theme of the Egyptians and the plagues and the Exodus. Now, if you want to read anything from the book, then read this last section whenever you have time, 16, 17, 18, and 19. If you have time to read anything, that would be the best thing to read. Okay, let's get into some of the errors of the book then. And in doing this, we'll take a look at some of the errors here in chapters 11, 12, and 16 to 19. In the first place, the spirit of the book, as we have said so many times already, is definitely not the Judeo-Christian one. Much of the imagery is borrowed from pagan Greek religion, various pagan religious rites. Even when he's not criticizing it, he's borrowing it for his own purposes. Greek philosophy and Greek rhetoric. And I've already said before, he has the Platonic conception of virtue as being the most important thing, and the Stoic conception of the universal logos. Not the personal logos of John 1, 1 to 4. Then in the second place, most of the errors really come toward the end of the book with the additions or inaccuracies seen in the account of Israel in Egypt, chapters 16 through 19. So let me give you just a few of these. Now there are many of them here, but let me give you a few of these. These are a few of the historical additions or inaccuracies. When you compare this with the biblical account of the Exodus of the Israelites from Egypt, you'll see it doesn't bear out. In the first place, the bite of locusts and flies killed many of the Egyptians. Now they had locusts, but the locusts bit the trees, not the Egyptians. They had flies or gnats or however you want to translate that word, and they probably bit the people, but they didn't die from that. That wasn't how God was going to kill them. God was going to kill them through the death of the firstborn, remember. The firstborn, that gets into sacrifice and atonement and all of that, and this non-faithful Jew didn't have a very good conception of that. Man is justified by his own good works, by being virtuous, not by blood atonement. You don't find that teaching here. That's chapter 16 and verse 9. I'm just picking out a few of the more ridiculous ones. 16:9. Those other men died from the bite of locusts and flies, and no remedy was found to save their lives, because it was fitting for them to be chastised by such creatures. But thy sons did not succumb to the fangs of snakes, however venomous, because thy mercy came to their aid and healed them. You see, he'll compare, this is what he's doing, he'll compare what went wrong with the Egyptians in Egypt, and then compare that with how Israel was preserved and blessed and protected while they wandered in the wilderness. He has reference to Moses lifting up the serpent on the pole here, remember. Now they died at first, but then they were really wounded. Then if they looked at the serpent in faith, then they were healed. So the contrast is remarkable. The Egyptians died just from the bite of a fly. He said, but Israel couldn't even be killed by snakes, by venomous snakes. That's the contrast. He's always skipping back and forth. What happened in Egypt, and then what happened in the Exodus with Israel in the wilderness. Then, how do you like this? Ghosts appear to frighten the Egyptians, and many of them die of fear when they see ghosts, which is a theme in one of the earlier apocryphal books that we've dealt with. This is chapter 17, verses 3 and 4. They died of fright when they saw a ghost. Now, do you remember reading that in Exodus anywhere, that they died from seeing a ghost? No. There was darkness that could be felt. And I'm sure they were terrified by that, but they didn't die by seeing ghosts. Thinking that their secret sins might escape detection beneath a dark pale of oblivion, they lay in disorder, dreadfully afraid, terrified by apparitions. For the dark corner that held them offered no refuge from fear, but loud, unnerving noises roared around them, and phantoms with downcast, unsmiling faces passed before their eyes. Not hardly found in the Exodus account in the book of Exodus. Let's see, I think I read earlier, I'll have to find one of the false teachings. That was back in chapter 11. We've already read that before, like verses 5 through 7. That the Nile River turned to blood because of infanticide. This is just one of many embellishments. But there was some direct connection, spilling of blood. Trying to kill all the children, spilling of blood. Somehow that turned that at least is connected, the infanticide of the Egyptians under the court order of Pharaoh, somehow is connected with the turning of the Nile River red or into blood. Then here's something else interesting. In the crossing of the Red Sea, the animals changed their natures. Now you'll have to read this to appreciate it. This is the very end of the book, chapter 19, verses 18 through 21. 19:18 through 21. The crossing of the Red Sea, animals changed their natures. Fish became lions, and lions became fish, and everything happened. Verse 18. That's why you haven't missed a lot if you haven't read this book. It's filled with embellishments. For as the notes of a lute can make various tunes with different names, though each retain its own pitch, so the elements combined among themselves in different ways as can be accurately inferred from the observation of what happened. Well, I haven't inferred that from the way I read the account. Land animals took to the water, and things that swim migrated to the dry land. Fire retained its normal power even when you put it underwater. And water forgot its quenching properties. Flames, on the other hand, failed to consume the flesh of perishable creatures that walked in them, and the substance of heavenly food, like ice and prone to melt, no longer melted. Well, he's simply saying that the fish could come out and walk on all four, and those who walked on all four could get in the water and swim. That never happened in the Exodus. Then a final error in this section of 16 to 19. Manna. Remember the manna? Have you ever wondered what it tastes like? Well, he says just imagine. Whatever your favorite taste is, that's what it tasted like. Manna was magic food that tasted just like every Israelite wanted it to. You like candy bars, it tasted like a candy bar. You like a sirloin, it tasted like a sirloin. Whatever every Israelite wanted it to individually taste like, so it did. This is chapter 16. I mean, that's so outlandish you have to want to read it. Chapter 16, verses 20 and 21. You say, I've got to see that. Did he really say that? Well, he certainly did. By contrast, it's always a contrast. What happened in Egypt, what happened with God's people. By contrast, thy own people were given angels' food. Well, the angels don't eat manna in heaven. I mean, there's a verse over in the book of Psalms that you might think that he's basing that on, and he could, but the angels don't eat manna. Now didst send them from heaven without labor of their own, bread ready to eat, rich in delight of every kind, and suited to every taste. The substance thou didst supply showed thy sweetness towards thy children, and the bread, serving the desire of each man who ate it, was changed into whatever he wished. You like Jordan almonds more than anything? Tasted just like a Jordan almond to you then. Whatever you liked is what it tasted like for you. So you can read that section and you'll come up with some more embellishments, like the blood of the river turning that way because of infanticide and so forth. Then in the third place, another property of the book is its false Platonic views of the soul. Now, false Platonic views can be seen throughout the book, but we're chiefly now concerned about Platonic views of the soul. And there are two of these in the book. In the first place, the author of the book teaches that the soul is trapped within the prison house of the body, meanwhile trying its best to escape. Now, this really is the view of the Christian church today. It's not the biblical view, but it really is the view. People think that the soul is some little thing down inside of you that is trying to get out of the body, because didn't Paul say that it's in my flesh dwells no good things, and it's my flesh that causes me to sin. My body sins. My soul doesn't sin, my body sins. Right. And so that is the typical view of the church today, and they got it right from Greek philosophy. That the soul somehow is some perfect little substance or little creature, a little man, like 2 inches high or something, that lives down inside you. That's beating the best he can, like in a wet paper bag, trying to get out of your stomach, get out of that region and go to be with God. That is the view of the church of our day. Maybe you don't know that, but it really is.
Amen.
They don't have a proper concept of the triune nature of man. Whereas this, chapter 9 and verse 15, and it was the view of Plato as well, that the body is the prison house of the soul. Just read the central phrase here. Because a perishable body weighs down the soul. It's got the soul trapped inside it. The soul is trying its best to fight its way out. Chapter 9 and verse 15. But it's locked in the prison house of the body. And then you know what else he teaches? Worse than that. He teaches the Platonic doctrine of the pre-existent soul. This is chapter 8, verses 19 and 20. Which means he does not believe in the doctrine of creation. Although he states that in the book, it's really not his belief. Oh, sure, maybe God made Adam's body from dust, but where'd he get his soul? Well, before we criticize him too much, can you answer that? Where'd the soul come from? You say, well, God gave it to him. Well, that means that God had it then. So how long did he have it? We know creation begins in the Genesis account. So did he create the soul then? Or where did he get the soul? As a child, I was born to excellence, and a noble soul fell to my lot. You know, there's a whole basket of them up in heaven. They're stored in bins up there. And once you're born, he said, I happened to get a noble one whenever I was born. God picked it out of a certain bin. You know, like inventory of souls, noble and bad souls. And he said, a noble soul fell to my lot. Or rather, I myself was noble. That's really a prideful view of yourself. And I entered into an unblemished body. You see, I entered. He's talking. He says, I existed before I had a body. Which means that the soul is eternal. The pre-existence of the soul. Which is another view of some people right in the churches today. Because they can't explain to you, and no one can explain to them, because nobody knows. Nobody has right teaching on the origin of the soul, the spirit, or really the body, because of the views of Darwin today. So the pre-existence of the soul. He said, I am a soul. He said, I entered into an unblemished body. Then, fourthly and finally, another false concept of the book, the world was made out of pre-existent matter. The Jewish view, the Christian view, was creatio ex nihilo. His view, as was the Greek view, was creatio ex hula, H-U-L-A. Creatio ex hula, creation from matter. Chapter 11 and verse 17. You'll have to turn and see this. These are some of the outstanding heresies of the book. So it's not one you want to spend time meditating upon. 11:17, for thy almighty hand which created the world out of nothing. The Bible says that things that are made were not made of things which do appear. Which created the world out of formless matter. It didn't have a form. Chapter 11 and verse 17, he formed it. It was matter. It already existed. Well, of course, we keep wanting to go one step further back. Well, where did the formless matter come from then? Which he doesn't give, which no one can give. Even the Big Bang Theory, something had to bang. So you got to go back and find the origin of that. So this is a false. This is a good Greek view, but it's not a Jewish view, though. It's not a biblical view. For thy almighty hand which created the world out of formless matter. God had matter and he made the world. It was not without other resource, and so forth. Goes on to talk about unknown ferocious monsters newly created. I don't know what he has reference to there, but because there weren't any ferocious monsters when they were newly created. They were all very good. Genesis 1 and verse 31. Many, many other errors found, especially in that last section, when you want to compare the Exodus account with chapter 16 through 19, then you'll find various other embellishments.